Welcome to Most Holy Family Monastery radio program. We're going to talk about some different topics, a number of different topics today. And we're going to start out with...
Yeah, we recently posted an article on our website about the Great Western Schism and what it teaches us about the post-Vatican II apostasy. And we consider this to be an important article because when people really delve into the facts of this particular period of church history, they learn some things that they, really didn't know before and that they really didn't think were possible. And I think it's important to just quickly review, even though it's covered in the article in detail, some of the major points that are explained in the article. First is that this whole Great Western Schism began, and we actually did cover this a little bit on the first radio program, but we're going to go a little bit more into detail here. This Great Western Schism began in 1378 after the election of Pope Urban VI. The popes had just returned to Rome after having resided in France for about 70 years, known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, due to political turmoil. And after they arrived back in Rome, there was a conclave in 1378, and there was so much uproar over the fear that a non-Italian or a non-Roman would be elected pope that a mob basically stormed the papal palace where they were holding the election when they thought that a non-Italian had been elected pope. Eventually, an Italian was elected by the cardinals and took the name of Pope Urban VI, and the cardinals who had elected him, 16 in all, confirmed that they had elected Pope Urban VI freely and canonically despite the unruly mob that was surrounding the conclave. But shortly after that time, however, the cardinals changed their mind. It seems as if they got disillusioned with returning to Rome, and they retreated to France. And there, 15 out of the 16 cardinals decided that the election of Pope Urban VI had been invalid because the unruly Roman mob had unlawfully influenced the election. And there was only one cardinal of the 16 who had taken part in the election who remained faithful to Pope Urban VI, but he died shortly after this time, leaving all of the cardinals of the church repudiating the true pope, holding that his election was invalid. And so this is really significant because it shows that it's certainly possible for all of the cardinals of the church to reject a validly elected pope. And then they proceeded to elect Clement VII as pope, or actually he was an anti-pope because we know that Pope Urban VI was the validly elected pope. And but they recognized Clement VII as the true pope, and he had obviously a wide following based on the argument that the election of Pope Urban VI was invalid due to the unruly Roman mob, and many people put their faith in the cardinals having repudiated the election of Pope Urban VI. And so this is how the Great Western Schism began, and it really was a nightmare. You had Christendom divided from that point. You had the anti-pope in Avignon excommunicating the pope in Rome, and vice versa. And this continued for a long period of time, and it was a period of massive confusion, and as Father John Lau says in his book Church History, the worst crisis through which the church has ever gone. But it was only to get worse from there because both camps, in order to try to end the schism, had taken measures to try to bring it to a conclusion, this horrible period of church history. And what they did was they agreed that upon electing a new pope, because during this period it lasted so long that popes died, like Pope Urban VI died, and he was succeeded by Pope Boniface the IX, and then he died, and he was succeeded by Pope Innocent VII. And the same thing in Avignon. Antipope Clement VII died in 1394 and was succeeded by Antipope Benedict XIII in the same year. And it got so bad that prior to taking part in the elections, both camps agreed that all the cardinals, if elected, would work sincerely to try to end the schism by abdicating if necessary, negotiating with the other party. And this really shows you how bad the situation had become and how much confusion there was. But eventually both sides failed to live up to their promises of working with the other party and abdicating if the majority of the cardinals agreed it was the best course of action. And so eventually cardinals from both sides and Christendom in general got fed up with this, and they actually withdrew from each camp a sizable number of cardinals to Pisa and arranged a council there with 24 cardinals. You had 14 cardinals from one side and 10 cardinals from the other side, and they jointly and unanimously elected a third claimant to the papacy. And that was Alexander V, and we know that he was actually an anti-pope. But to many at the time, it was believed that he was the true pope, and actually right away he had the widest support in Christendom because it was believed that he had gained the support of both camps and that he had been elected in a united action of the Church's cardinals.
And for a long duration of time, the true pope had the least amount of support out of all three claimants.
Yeah, shortly after that time, Alexander V, the one elected at Pisa, didn't live very long, and he was succeeded by the infamous John the 23rd. And both of those gentlemen were the most supported of the three at the time. And Pope Gregory XII, who was the true pope, who reigned from 1406 to 1415, he was the least supported pope in history. He was the least recognized of the three claimants, and he was rejected at the end by almost all of Christendom. And so this shows us how ridiculous it is for individuals to say that what we're saying and what others are saying, that the post-Vatican II crisis is a result of anti-popes who have falsely tried to impose upon the world a counterfeit religion and a counterfeit church, that this is a patent absurdity, as some of them have said. It couldn't be farther from the truth.
And you have someone like St. Vincent Ferrer, who was actually supporting, for a long period of time, an anti-pope. At the same time, he was working miracles. And so this goes to show, like some people ask about Padre Pio, and they say, well, if he was able to work miracles, how come he didn't realize that Paul VI was an anti-pope? Because God doesn't reveal everything to human beings. And if it doesn't compromise your faith, or if you're not giving in to heresy, it's possible to be confused for a certain period of time as to whether a certain person may be a legitimate claimant to the papacy. But when the point in time comes where you have to start to compromise your faith, or you recognize or know about a person's manifest heresies, then a person would have an obligation to reject that person as a Catholic. But it just goes to show you that, some people can be deceived, for a period of time, and God's not going to reveal the full extent of the reality of what's happening to even great saints like St. Vincent Ferrer or a Padre Pio.
And what's interesting is that shortly after Pope Urban VI had been rejected by 15 out of the 16 cardinals who had elected him, there was a leading canonist of the time named Baldus, who published a treatise disagreeing with their decision. He said, quote, "There were no grounds on which the cardinals could repudiate a pope once they had elected him, and none on which the Church as a whole could depose him, except persistent and open heresy." So we can see even at this time it was clearly understood that a pope who were to become a heretic would cease to be the pope. You don't depose him, he deposes himself by virtue of his manifest heresy. And
you also had different people also that actually were not going to certain priests because they thought they were in union with an anti-pope. And so this caused, even more confusion and an even greater terrible form of this crisis, because people were not going and receiving the sacraments because they didn't want to commit a sin they felt by going to a priest who was in union with an anti-pope.
And what's interesting is that people of the time didn't really see a way out of the crisis. They, at one point they just didn't know how it would ever be resolved, similar to what people say about our situation today. And I think it's important to mention, switching gears here, the recent heresy that Benedict XVI uttered on the Orthodox. Benedict XVI, as we posted on our website, he recently, in a joint ecumenical Vesper service with Protestants and Schismatics, in which he took active part in non-Catholic worship, which is condemned by Pope Pius XI, he actually said that we've come to know and to love the Orthodox Church. Now, this is quite a heresy, considering that the Orthodox Church is a schismatic and heretical sect which rejects the papacy, Vatican I, the Council of Trent, the last 13 councils of the Church. And he's saying that he not only loves the members of the Church, he loves the Orthodox Church itself. And this is just incredible, because what could be more heretical than saying that you love a non-Catholic and schismatic sect? And what's interesting is that recently a publishing group in California sent out a flyer in which they're advertising for some of their new material. And one of the items was an attack on sedevacantism and those who would, reject the post-conciliar church as a non-Catholic sect and the post-conciliar anti-popes as not true popes. And it says in here, the sedevacantists who hold that the Mass is invalid, the sacraments are invalid, and the priests administering the sacraments were not properly ordained. What is a lay person to make of all this cacophony of conflicting ideas, leading to isolation and despair? And they're saying that this thing they're offering makes sense of it all, and gives clear evidence of the flawed reasoning of those who would like to see you join them outside the church, out of which there is neither salvation, holiness, nor real happiness. And this is what is being promoted by this so-called traditionalist publishing house in California. And we really have to ask them, are they insane? They're saying that people who reject Benedict XVI as a heretic are outside the church, when Benedict XVI is saying that he loves the Orthodox Church. He loves the schismatic sect. I mean, these people are just piling damnation on themselves. I mean, they couldn't be more condemned out of their own mouths. By condemning those who would reject this guy as a schismatic, what about Benedict XVI? He's saying he loves the entire schismatic church. Are these people brain dead? No, they're just soul dead.
Yeah.
They're just complete liars. And it's really an outrage. And someone like this is definitely been ipso facto excommunicated from the Catholic Church. No doubt about it. This person's seen the evidence, rejects it, holds that those who don't adhere to these manifestly heretical, non-Catholic anti-popes are outside the church. And they don't say that Benedict XVI, even though he's saying he loves the whole schismatic church, is even a heretic who's outside the church. It's just an outrage. And that really brings us to, someone wrote us an email asking us about the book by Peter Veer or Very. I'm not sure how you pronounce the heretic
and
name.
just before you mention that also, as far as this organization, one of the problems is that some of these people may realize, if they recognize the facts and accept the true reality of what's happening, that these guys are heretics and therefore not popes, they're not going to be able to sell that much stuff. See, this is an organization that just sells tons of stuff. It's a business. And so therefore, they're going to sell all kinds of stuff. And so if you really accept the full truth of what's happening out there, you can only promote the pure truth. You can't just have all kinds of stuff that you sell, this stuff, that stuff, so people are basically confused and they're getting truth mixed with error. That's what a lot of people do, and it costs them their souls.
And they think that there's no, they don't realize that when they get into the avenue of distributing materials on the Catholic faith and instructing people on what they must believe, that their level of culpability rises. And so they have to be that much more solicitous for what they're going to be putting out. And they think, as he was just saying, that they can just, this is somewhat neat, I'm going to sell this, and it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
And someone asked us about the book by Patrick Madrid and Peter Veer or Very, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his name, More Catholic Than the Pope. This is a book against traditionalism. what we think of this, I've quickly gone through the book. Basically, the whole book is about the Society of St. Pius X and how they don't like the Society of St. Pius X. It doesn't have much of anything of substance regarding the heresies of the post-conciliar church or their responses to those who would say that the post-conciliar church is heretical. But what's very interesting is, again, and it ties into what we're talking about now, about how Benedict XVI just said he loves the schismatic church, that on page 130 of that book, Patrick Madrid and Peter Very say, in Archbishop Lefebvre having consecrated these bishops, and the 4 men he illicitly ordained as bishops plunged themselves headlong into schism. So they're saying here, bluntly, clearly, that the Society of St. Pius X, for having Archbishop Lefebvre and his 4 bishops, and it indicates elsewhere that the followers of the Society of St. Pius X are in schism, they're in schism for
doing consecrations of bishops in the traditional rite on, I think it was June 30th, 1988. And within 72 hours, they were excommunicated by John Paul II, showing again that the only religion that isn't tolerated by the post-Vatican II Church is traditional Catholicism. Everything else is accepted. Every religion's endorsed except for traditional Catholicism. You want traditional rites to be maintained and perpetuated, you're going to be excommunicated immediately.
And so it's so outrageous and ridiculous and hypocritical that they declare that the group like the Society of St. Pius X, from their standpoint, is in schism. Meanwhile, Benedict XVI is praising the whole schismatic sect again and again. And what's amazing about this is, in his book, Pope Fiction, Patrick Madrid, who was also the co-author of that other book we're referring to, he says on page 152, it's really interesting, he said he's discussing an argument made by the Eastern schismatics who call themselves Orthodox. And he says, quote, "This argument is sometimes raised by our Eastern Orthodox brethren." So Patrick Madrid calling the members of the schismatic church our Eastern Orthodox brethren. But in the same book on page 274, referring to a sedevacantist, he says, quote, "A position paper put out by one schismatic group of Marian sedevacantist priests put it more starkly." And then he quotes something. So he's clearly saying on page 274 that the sedevacantist priests are schismatics. Meanwhile, on page 152, he says that the Eastern Orthodox are brethren. This just shows you how evil these guys are. And these are the type of individuals who try to explain away every heresy of the post-Vatican II sect. I mean, they're so bad-willed and blinded that they won't even come to denounce like Assisi as apostasy, where John Paul II arranged for the heads of false religions to worship false gods. I mean, they're not even at the point where they're rejecting this as novelty and a revolution against Catholic teaching.
I mean, and these people, if they honestly look at the facts, they'll see that, what they're publishing here, what they're promoting, is a total lie. They're calling a group that would claim to hold all of Catholic teaching a schismatic group, or a schismatic priest in the case of a priest. And they're calling a formally schismatic sect a group that says they don't accept the last 13 councils of the Church. They don't accept papal infallibility.
They constantly carry on independent.
I mean, it's just basically like a Protestant church that has valid sacraments. They say that they're our brothers. I mean, it's so evil.
Yeah, so
and so they're just liars. And so they just basically, they take the mark of the beast, really. They sell their souls out, because if they regarded these, quote, schismatic groups that the post-Vatican II Church regards as schismatics, these independent sedevacantist groups, for example, if they called them brothers, that may not, be too pleasing to the ears of the Novus Ordo Church. So they just say that they're schismatics, but the open schismatic group doesn't even claim to be Catholic. They're our brothers because John Paul II regards them as our brothers. John Paul II gives them relics of saints. John Paul II gives them donations, including a $100,000 donation to one schismatic church. John Paul II was at the laying of the foundation stone of these schismatic churches. So they just accept the lie to keep their career going and for whatever other reasons. But the bottom line is that it will cost them their salvation if they don't change their position on this issue.
And that brings us to another point that's related, which is that we were recently contacted by someone we know who is considering leaving the Catholic Church and embracing Eastern Orthodoxy. And we posted on our website a quick email response to that individual, which brings up really the central point which quickly blows away the whole Eastern Orthodox religion, which is that the Eastern Orthodox hold that the first 7 councils of the Church, which the Catholic Church would recognize as dogmatic or ecumenical or general councils, the Eastern Orthodox, quote, Church, accepts those as dogmatic, and they would hold that to deny the teachings of those councils would make you a heretic and would place you outside the Church. But when you ask them, what are the criteria which determine that those first 7 councils are binding under pain of heresy? Why am I going to be anathematized or someone else if I reject a particular teaching of one of those councils? They can't answer the question. As Catholics we can, of course, because those councils were approved by a pope, but they reject the supreme authority of the pope. So the answer is they have no answer to that question. It's completely illogical, and in certain ways it's more inherently illogical than Protestantism. Because, for instance, the First Council of Constantinople, which is the second ecumenical council of the Church on 381, that had 150 bishops at Constantinople. And the Eastern Orthodox would say that this is a binding council, a council which if you reject, you are anathematized. But there was a council in the year 449, a heretical Monophysite council, which had about 147 or 146 bishops, about basically the exact same number of bishops as the First Council of Constantinople. They reject the Second Council of Ephesus, as the Catholics do, as a robber council, which taught heresy, the heretical Monophysite heresy, which denies that Christ has 2 natures. So why do they reject the one council and accept the other? Or a better question is, how can they say that one is absolutely bound under pain of heresy to accept what these 150 bishops decided at Constantinople I, but you're absolutely bound to reject under pain of heresy what the approximately 50 bishops at Ephesus II endorsed? It's completely illogical. And if anyone really internalizes that fact, the whole Eastern Orthodox religion crumbles. It's a complete farce. And so that's the point. I mean, there are other things that could be brought up. I mean, the fact that the Eastern Orthodox reject the clear scriptural teaching on the primacy of St. Peter. I mean, it couldn't be clearer. Our Lord gives the keys to the kingdom of heaven to St. Peter alone in Matthew 16. Every time the apostles are listed in the gospel, even though the order of the other apostles varies, St. Peter's name is always first. St. Peter stands up at the Council of Jerusalem in the Acts of the Apostles, to bring silence to the assembly when they were disputing different matters. We clearly see that Jesus Christ entrusts the flock to St. Peter in John 21:15-17, clearly giving him jurisdiction, over the flock. I mean, that's so clear. To no one else does he give that. Then we see in Luke 22 where he prays for St. Peter alone, that his faith fail not, that he has an unfailing faith. It's so clear that St. Peter is the head of the church with jurisdiction over the flock. And so to deny that, I mean, you just have to be dishonest. That's in addition to the fundamental illogic at the heart of this whole Eastern Orthodox religion, and not to mention the testimony of the fathers of the church who clearly testify to the fact that St. Peter died in Rome, that he was the bishop of Rome, that the Church of Rome has supreme jurisdiction, and so forth. And so that's why, really, once a person becomes Eastern Orthodox, and we've had lengthy discussions with some of these individuals, they don't believe in anything because there's no mechanism by which they could believe in any dogma, because you could never say that one is bound to believe in this without a supreme bishop, because you've had bishops, according to them, all the bishops are equal. And you've had bishops who assert the true teaching. You've had bishops who reject the true teaching with authority and even anathematize those who don't believe what they're saying. So if all the bishops are equal, the church has contradicted itself thousands of times. And you could never say that one is bound to believe in this particular teaching. And really, in lengthy discussions, it becomes clear that these people don't really believe in anything, that they don't believe in any dogma at all. I mean, and it logically follows. And that's why Pope Leo XIII says that he who rejects one dogma absolutely rejects all faith. And another thing that's been in the news recently is the talk that the conciliar church, the counter-church of the Vatican II anti-popes, is going to abolish limbo. This has been all over the headlines. Apparently a commission under anti-pope Benedict XVI is discussing the issue. Basically what they're proposing is that there's no higher part of hell where the unbaptized infants go, which was confirmed by Pope Pius VI in his dogmatic bull Auctorum Fidei, where he condemned those who deny such a place. And we know infallibly that those who die without baptism cannot be saved. It's been explicitly taught at the Council of Florence and Trent that infants who die without baptism cannot be saved. All who die in original sin or mortal sin descend into hell. This is a defined dogma. Couldn't be clearer. So anyone who would reject this is a public heretic. But the conciliar church is now saying that limbo doesn't exist and that all unbaptized infants who die go to heaven. And they haven't officially released this document, but this is what's coming out in the articles which cover their discussions on this issue. And so if this occurs, of course, this would be another bombshell heresy, huge revolutionary rejection of Catholic dogma. But actually, I still don't think that it would convince a lot of these hardened false traditionalists and apostate defenders of the Novus Ordo Church. I think they would just brush it off or come up with some other ridiculous explanation. But that's the way it's looking, that they're going to release a document which says that all unbaptized infants go to hell. And we know that Benedict XVI, in a number of his books, says that the doctrine which held that infants needed to be baptized for sanctifying grace is unenlightened. And he's made statements indicating that he holds that the necessity of infant baptism is completely meaningless. And so that's something to keep your eyes out for.
Yeah, we on this program may be going not for 2 hours. We might only go for an hour, possibly, maybe a little bit longer. We wanted to mention again that we have this special, the 3 DVD special for $8 that contains 3 magazines, the book Outside the Catholic Church, There Is Absolutely No Salvation, flyers, 4 audio tapes, and again the 3 DVDs which contain 10 different programs. And that's for $8. That includes media mail shipping. If you want it faster, you can get it faster. Check the online store that we have if you do want it shipped more quickly. Also, we expect the video Abortion, Rock Music, and Freemasonry Exposed will be up on the website this week. And also, going back to the specials that we have some of the older versions of the DVDs that we had when we put some of our programs on DVDs, like 2 programs as opposed to the 3 that we have now, 3, and 4 on one DVD. Some of the older DVDs that we have are now available for the shipping price alone. So we have a PDF up on the website that you can click on to look at that order form. You can call us or you can order online.
Yeah, we also, as readers of our website, noticed we posted a video online. Anti-Pope John Paul II preaches the gospel of the Antichrist, that every man is God. We posted it about a week ago. And the information contained in that video is extremely important for people to digest and take a look at. But I just want to make a quick mention about one of the quotes we discussed in the e-exchanges, which was John Paul II's homily from 1982, where he's commenting on John chapter 8. And in John chapter 8, verse 23, our Lord describes himself as the one from above, and he says that man is the one from below. And we quote that in the e-exchanges section of our website. And what's fascinating is John Paul II's homily from March 30th, 1982. He boldly says that each man is the man from above and the man from below. And I just wanted to quote that and make a quick comment. This is John Paul II, March 30th, 1982. Quote, "Looking at himself, man discovers also, as Christ says in the dialogue with the Pharisees, what is from below and what is from above. Man discovers within himself, this is a constant experience, the man from below and the man from above. Not two men, but almost two dimensions of the same man, the man that is each one of us, of you, he, she." So he's clearly saying here that each man, you, he, she, himself, okay, is the man from above and the man from below. And what I wanted to mention, which was not mentioned in the e-exchanges, is that this means that John Paul II was declaring himself to be Christ. He, in addition to everyone else, he's saying that each person, I, you, he, she, is the man from above and the man from below. So this is absolute proof that John Paul II was showing himself as if he were God in the temple of God, in the Vatican. And this is the quote, as we mentioned in the exchanges, where we really started to figure out exactly what John Paul II's program was with regard to his constant preaching on man.
And also, we wanted to mention, too, if you do want to call us, the phone number again is 1-800-275-1126. We will be putting up these programs, the last few that we have done, hopefully in the next week or two. We will be putting the programs up on the website, so you'll be able to listen to them again. And
yeah, there was an interesting article, and we were probably going to link to it in the next few days. It's an article about a prominent Novus Ordo seminary, and it was written by a conservative member of the Novus Ordo Church who left one of these seminaries because he was so appalled by what was going on there. And this article was actually published in the Homiletic and Pastoral Review, and it's on the internet, and we'll probably link to it. But I just wanted to read a few things from it because it's so revealing about what's going on in the Novus Ordo Church in general. And this person says, after spending 4 years in a neo-modernist Roman Catholic seminary, I have come to the firm belief that the source of the current crisis in the Church in the United States can be traced directly to the seminaries. Okay, and he goes on to describe some of the things that went on at one of the prominent seminaries in the United States, Novus Ordo. He talks about how at Mass, the priest was at the Novus Ordo, quote, Mass, the priest was often simply referred to as the presider. He was the one leading us in prayer, animating the community. He goes on to say, we as seminarians were not allowed to wear clerical clothing. This was because the collar was a sign of clericalism. Though the rector had been known to tell bishops he did not want to confuse ministry with the wearing of the collar, the reality behind abolishing the collar in our seminary was that it was a cause of great anxiety for the feminists. So basically, at this prominent seminary in the Novus Ordo Church, the collar was outlawed because it would offend the feminists. He also says, we were told from the beginning that seminarians were not to refer to any of the faculty as father or sister. We were not to be caught up with titles, as this was another form of clericalism. These things would also offend against the ecumenical mission that the seminary was committed to. So the terms father and sister were unecumenical, so they were not used. He goes on to say...
And also, I think, doesn't he point out that actually some of the guys in there that got passed and, as far as approved of and sort of got through a few stages, actually had to lie and sort of say, when they asked them questions, will you approve of women priests? They either said yes, or they said they'll think about it, something like that. They either lied or they didn't tell the truth. And basically, when they were asked by some, quote, conservative seminarian, why would you just lie about this? To get ahead or not say anything or not speak out against all these abuses and abominations, they just said, well, I wouldn't be ordained otherwise. They would be booted right out. They wouldn't even have gotten through the initial stages if they either maybe didn't lie or just keep their mouth shut about what was going on.
Yeah, well, the book Goodbye Good Men by Michael Rose, which I'm going to quote a few things from, he points out that in the interview process where they're screening candidates for the seminary, that they basically ask them things like this: are you against women priests? And questions that would, probe into whether they are conservative in nature or not. And if they were, then they're less likely to be admitted. And so they sort of had to downplay what their true feelings were. And this particular individual writing this article, he was actually more honest, and he said he wouldn't stand for any of this, and that's why he eventually had to leave. And what's interesting, he's talking about how effeminate the seminarians were. And he says this was a volatile issue in the seminary, as there were sizable numbers of men on both sides of the issue. During a class conference, the question that was raised was the unchecked, effeminate, scandalous behavior of some seminarians. The negative reputation of the seminary gained by this recurring image, and the kinds of role models the seminary was tacitly approving and recommending these men for orders. The vice-rector replied by saying the seminary admitted men of both orientations, meaning homosexual or heterosexual, but the policy was that all had to be celibate. But he goes on to say, how it was just horrible, and how he was even embarrassed to, discuss these things with his family members or make them aware of what was going on. That's how bad the problem with homosexuality was at this prominent seminary in the Novus Ordo Church. He goes on to say that for our first academic year, we had to study Richard P. McBrien's Catholicism. This is the president of theology at Notre Dame, radical apostate.
Who's never been censured or excommunicated, as far as I know, not once.
Yeah, he just continues. And they studied this at the seminary, and he says, quote, "This book set the most fertile foundations for doubt and intellectual departure from the true Catholic faith." This is what they're learning at the seminary. "It was through subtle and clever deception by veiled, ambiguous language that McBrien's book was so effective. It became the basis for the reasonableness and goodness of dissent. Some of his more exemplary ideas, implied and cleverly suggested throughout the book, are that we don't have to believe in the virginity of the Blessed Mother, that we don't have to believe or assent to follow church teaching unless it explicitly states it has dogmatic status, that we must admit to Jesus having been ignorant and in error." And so this is the formation they're receiving, and this is why you see what you see in the Novus Ordo diocese.
And you see these plays that are going on that are just absolutely scandalous at Notre Dame University. A gay and lesbian day or something like that was at Notre Dame.
Queer festivals.
A queer festival. And actually up here in Rochester, St. John Fisher College, one person who attends there came up to me and he said that they had a cross-dressing day. This is fully approved of by the so-called Catholic staff, the priests there and so forth, a cross-dressing day. And this guy thought it was just horrible, and he's just trying to find out what's going on. And so...
Yeah, and we've established that the Novus Ordo Church, of course, rejects the Catholic faith. It's completely apostate. You'd think maybe they would stand for some of the moral issues, some of these, quote, bishops, but they don't stand for anything.
And also, one other thing is that you have also, like in Ohio, this Mr. Joseph Wicker, who still may be screening candidates for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. And he claims that he's a Rosicrucian. He's the worshipful master of Mount Washington Masonic Lodge, number 643, I think it is.
Yeah,
and this is the guy that's basically the diocese says, okay, you can go see Mr. Joseph Wicker, and he'll decide whether you're a suitable candidate for the priesthood. I mean, think about this. And then also, I think it was in Springfield, Illinois, a couple years ago, the new apostate bishop that they installed up there actually had his installation ceremony in the Shriners Temple up there. So, I mean, this is what you have here, truly a counter-church.
Yeah, and this guy continues, and he says, "At the seminary, we often studied Protestant theologies right alongside Rahner, Schielebeck's, Kung, Boff, and so forth." So they're studying Protestant theologies, and he goes on to say that in the area of spirituality, we had workshops on women's spirituality, for something about collaborative ministry and social justice. And he says, devotion to Mary as Blessed Mother was allowed, but generally not encouraged, as such a servile image and traditional feminine values were seen by many as not in keeping with feminist theology. He goes on to say that this is incredible. He says he's talking about how the rosary was allowed and then discouraged, but then they allowed it again. He goes, the rosary, prayed in the main chapel by a group of seminarians, was tolerated for a time, but eventually the tension created in the seminary over this group brought it to an end. So the rosary was tolerated for a little while, but people were so opposed to it that it stopped. And then he goes, however, to please bishops and as a kind of token gesture to the conservative element in the seminary, the rosary was suddenly allowed again, but then only in the small hall chapel where there was no Blessed Sacrament, quote. 1 day a week, okay, between breakfast and classes. The reason behind not allowing the rosary in the main chapel was that the chapel is for liturgical celebrations, not devotions. So this is what's going on. This is the quality of spiritual formation at the prominent Novus Ordo seminaries. And he goes on to say how he appealed to the Novus Ordo bishop, and at first the Novus Ordo bishop was receptive, but eventually abandoned him and didn't do anything about it. And so they actually sided with the authorities in the apostate seminary who dismissed this individual for opposing these things.
Yeah, and actually some of these bishops apparently at their seminaries actually had people to basically learn more about, I guess, sexuality. They actually had them watch pornographic films at the seminary. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. I think one guy actually was telling me that he went to a priest and he's thinking about going into a seminary, and he said, go out and, experiment with life, go out and commit sin. He actually told him to go out and commit any kind of sin that you feel like doing. And so he actually followed the priest's advice. It was just horrible. And, he told me about it, and I was just like, I mean, it's his fault. I mean, he followed his advice, but I mean, it just shows you the guy's going to what he thinks is a Catholic priest, and the priest is telling him to go out and commit sin so he can sort of, experience life, as he calls it. It's just an abomination.
And this whole situation is covered more in depth in the book Goodbye, Good Men by this Michael Rose, who's a defender of the Novus Ordo Church and unfortunately quite heretical, who
at the beginning of the book, he actually says that, John Paul II is one of the holiest men on the planet or something like that?
Something like,
go down as one of the greatest saints in history.
Describing whether these seminarians had any model, and he's saying that John Paul II is a model for some of them, whom many of them consider to be a great saint, whom they consider John Paul II to be a great saint, and he doesn't disagree with that at all. So basically, John Paul II might be a great saint. This is by the guy who's writing the expose of the seminaries. To show, unfortunately, what a defender of the new false church he is. But in his book, he has some incredible quotations about what's going on, such as on page 55 and 56, he says, quote, according to former seminarians and recently ordained priests, this gay subculture is so prominent at certain seminaries that these institutions have earned nicknames such as Notre Flame for Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans and Theological Closet for Theological College at the Catholic University of America. St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore has earned the nickname the Pink Palace. And nothing is done, basically, about this. Before I get to that, I want to give another quote. This is from the book. Father Andrew Walter, ordained for the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut in 2000, spent several semesters at the Baltimore School as a seminarian for the Diocese of Paterson, New Jersey. The homosexual problem was so bad when he was there, he explained, that some of the students and faculty used to get dressed up in leather to go to the block, Baltimore's equivalent to 42nd Street in Manhattan. This is actually a quote from a former seminarian.
This is what people are contributing to, by the way. This is where the people just throw money in their collection basket. It's going to support seminaries like this. It's maybe going off to pay off a pedophile lawsuit. It's maybe going to provide printing material, the cost for printing, sex education manuals in so-called Catholic schools. this is where your money's going to. And a lot of people don't even care, as far as you ask them, do you ever know what you're supporting? You ever investigate it? Do you ever know what they use your money for? And they don't even care. They just feel like as long as I just drop the check in there, that basically God's going to reward me with heaven. Yeah, I mean, it's just that simple. Like, they don't have to know the faith. They don't have to find out what's going on. They could care less about all this stuff.
And it's such a scandal because, like, we're talking about the Holy Catholic priesthood here, and like, basically, if you try to convert non-Catholics, especially Protestants, and you will discover that their constant response is reference to the sex scandal in the Novus Ordo Church and homosexual priests. And so the fact that God allowed this to occur in such a notorious way, that in itself is a strong indication of where we are in history. Because it's such a stumbling block for non-Catholics to embrace the true Catholic faith when they see this, to try to convince them, no, these guys are part of the false church. These guys aren't true Catholics. These guys are part of the church which doesn't condemn homosexuality, the phony church. Okay, a person of goodwill, with some extraordinary graces can see through all of this. But the fact that God has allowed this to come out, it's another, without even considering the other material, strong indication that we're in the final deception.
Yeah, and also you have basically the Novus Ordo Church going bankrupt. I mean, absolutely bankrupt. Right in Spokane, Washington, just recently, I believe it was, or is happening right now. They're actually having to sell off, what is it up there?
Their diocese.
The whole diocese. I mean, this is what is going to happen, and you're going to have these evil attorneys, or actually some of them that, legitimately maybe had people that were abused by some of these priests. And as far as I'm concerned, the Novus Ordo Church is spiritually bankrupt. They might as well be, physically bankrupt too.
And I just wanted to continue with another quote here. This is from the same book. Quote, Father John Trujillo of Harrisburg, and he appears on EWTN, remembers visiting St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore when he was a seminarian in Pennsylvania. There was no discretion at all, he said, of the gay subculture there. The few times I was there, some of the seminarians would literally dress like gays from the village. They would even go so far as to wear pink silk. It was like going to see La Quai Joie Fla. In my day at St. Mary's, said Father John Despard, now a religious order priest from the southeast, down the hall there would be two guys together in the shower and everybody knew it. And he goes on to say, every Friday a van took priesthood students to a nearby city to cruise the gay bars. And this is a book by a defender of the Novus Ordo Church.
This is your, quote, non-schismatic seminary that's in good standing.
Oh, yeah, and that brings us to another point, is that nothing is done to stop this. Homosexuals aren't barred from the seminaries. You don't see, swift action taken against any of these places. But when the Fraternity of St. Peter, and we, as people know, we're not in favor of the Fraternity of St. Peter, but they are at least, intellectually opposed to the new Mass, okay, in a certain way. They prefer the traditional Mass, and
some of the other changes they don't like,
Yeah, when the Vatican thought that they were getting a little too traditional, they quickly and swiftly replaced Father Bizig as head and implanted someone else who they thought was more part of the new religion.
Yeah.
And so this shows you how evil it is. They'll quickly move to replace someone like that.
They'll quickly move against Lefebvre. Within 72 hours, he's excommunicated. But
John Kerry,
all the evil, all the pro-abortion politicians, nothing's ever done. And actually, they're not against abortion at all, as maybe we mentioned in a previous program, that when the U.S. bishops said, well, each bishop can decide what his policy is in regards to giving communion to pro-abortion politicians that claim to be Catholic, they wrote to the Vatican, and it was Joseph Ratzinger at that time that responded and said that the U.S. bishops, of letting each bishop decide whether they want to give communion to pro-abortion politicians who claim to be Catholic, is very much in line with the way the Vatican sees this issue. So therefore, you can be for the killing of the unborn. You can vote for it, you can support it, and you can be in total good standing in the Novus Ordo post-Vatican II Church. You can receive the sacraments. Nothing's said, nothing is done, nothing will happen.
And they point out not just the immorality at the seminaries. This book documents, the stuff they were being taught. One seminarian, quote, lost his faith because of a Christology course they were required to take, basically attacking our Lord. This is what they're learning. The first book they read was Albert Schweitzer's Quest for the Historical Jesus, which Perron called a very damaging book that dismissed all of the church's teachings as unreliable myths. That's a book they're reading in the seminary. As he was saying, this Mason is screening candidates in Cincinnati and even wearing his Masonic ring during interviews. And what's interesting is that some of the conservative guys who make it through, like slightly conservative by Novus Ordo standards, like John Trujillo,
he actually had to go to a few different seminaries, right? He was like, he had to leave one and go to the other.
I think so, yeah.
Other seminary, even though he had like a 4.0 grade point average, at these places. He was acing the courses, but he's still, because he wasn't sort of accepting some things, he was still basically had to leave and maybe go somewhere else or complete his courses at a different seminary. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
And he would point out, and he's quoted in this book saying how basically he had to just, bite his tongue the whole time, and that it was just a constant struggle. And we were discussing that for anyone to see this kind of stuff going on and to remain in that place, that would be a mortal sin in itself. I mean, even if you don't like what's going on, to remain in a place like that. And so even the ones who are slightly conservative, who are making their way through, fighting their way through, they're still sinning mortally by endorsing such a situation, by staying there for so long. And actually, I firmly believe that a lot of these modernist, quote, priests who are somewhat conservative, like this John Trujillo and this Father Francis Mary Stone on EWTN, these guys who are slightly more conservative, I believe that they are led by the devil to enter the Novus Ordo, quote, priesthood, because if you didn't have any conservative-minded individuals in the Novus Ordo Church,
on some issues,
like slightly conservative, giving the appearance of life in the Novus Ordo Church, you have these particular guys like, teaching certain things that are somewhat conservative against Protestants and so forth, then basically anyone who's conservative at all would look toward the traditional Catholic faith and, the traditional outlets. And so they serve their purpose.
They give life to the false church.
Yeah. And he says, this is Trujillo, we used to say if you wore a cassock in the seminary, you were a reactionary daughter of Trent. If you wore women's underwear, they'd make you seminarian of the year. This is a quote. We had a few guys who sometimes wore women's clothing, lingerie, makeup, and some who were as effeminate as could be. They would call each other by female names. This is just, so outrageous. And these guys stay in these places. It's just totally ridiculous.
Yeah, it's something where that's a way that you can sin by silence. If you don't, after time, and something's going on that's a flagrant violation, you either have to correct the person, or in this case, where nothing's going to be corrected, you have to leave. You have to get out of that place.
And one of the things we're going to be pointing out in a future work is that, and we've made reference to it in some of the other things, is that the connection between homosexuality and idolatry. St. Paul clearly links the two in Romans 1. He talks about how because they knew God and glorified him not, but worshipped the flesh and other things, God gave them up to unnatural lusts. And so homosexuality is a result of demonic possession and demonic takeover. And that's why actually, in many cases, you can identify those who are afflicted with it without even, them revealing that this is what they are, because the demon's making himself manifest.
It manifests itself a lot of times with the shiny eyes or the very effeminate voice. What explains that? Really, it's something where what explains how effeminate they are? That just happens naturally? No. And also, as far as these shiny, I believe you're seeing actually demonic possession when you see that, and maybe it doesn't manifest itself with all of them, but a goodly portion of them it does, and it's just amazing. It's just amazing that people would consider these kinds of seminaries to be Catholic, And, a place such as ours is outside the church. Actually, we just got a call not too long ago from a young person from California who was actually, he goes to a, quote, Catholic high school maybe, and he was given an order by the teacher to do a report on different schismatic groups. And actually, we were listed as a schismatic group and that he should do a paper on our monastery. And so he called up, and I told him about what's going on, and he was just, pretty amazed to hear the truth of what was going on. He probably had never heard any of this ever in his whole life. And it's just absolutely incredible that, people would say, these guys, this isn't heresy. The Orthodox schismatics are not schismatics. They're our brothers, as Patrick Madrid says. But we're outside the church. We're schismatics. It's just amazing. And actually, I was just talking to a Novus Ordo priest today and telling him the same thing of what's going on and so forth. And he's bringing up how, well, the church is infallible, the church is infallible. And he hasn't realized yet that that's one of the main points that we prove, is that if he believes Paul VI was a true pope, Paul VI absolutely ratified all 16 documents of Vatican II. They contain direct heresy against the infallible teachings of the Catholic Church on numerous points. Therefore, a true pope cannot solemnly ratify heresies. Therefore, it proves the post-Vatican II Novus Ordo Church is not an infallible church. It's a fallible church, and therefore it is not the Catholic Church.
And on a related point to that of the clear heresies in Vatican II, we were recently watching an EWTN program about it had the apostolic, quote, nuncio to Jerusalem, Archbishop Sambi, who was discussing Benedict XVI's statements on Islam. And he was talking about how the Koran basically...
Oh, yeah, he was actually saying that he was asked when he was in Indonesia whether he regarded the Koran as a holy book. And he said, the Bible is our holy book, but I respect, your book is holy, therefore I believe it is a holy book. And it's just all about... and he's quoting Benedict XVI because over the last few weeks, Benedict XVI has been loading praises upon Islam. They worship the one true God with us, the profound respect that we have for Islam and other religions. I mean, on and on and on, and praising and esteeming the false religion of Islam. And basically what this boils down to for the post-Vatican II Church is that all we're supposed to do as what they believe are Catholics is to live in peace and brotherhood, just be friendly to other people, help them build homes, help them build houses and other things, and just live at peace, respect them, esteem their religion. And this other bishop that they had on the same program was talking about how, God has the power to convert everyone to the Catholic faith, so I guess he doesn't want these people that are Muslims to be Catholics. So therefore, their religion sort of must be true, and that's the way God has led them to believe in Islam. I mean, it's just utter apostasy. And he was talking about how the priest in the area he was in Africa, they actually they hacked the priest to death. These evil Muslim people, and they burned down actually this bishop's his residence. And you would think that would cause some righteous anger at these people, in their false religion. But no, not at all. It's just sort of like, well, we just have to dialogue, we just have to live in peace and brotherhood. And basically, there's no problem with the religion. That's the clear-cut conclusion that they are drawing.
Yeah, and this papal nuncio, quote, Archbishop Sambi, was basically trying to assure everyone in this interview that Benedict XVI didn't mean any disrespect to Islam. He told everyone that his speech didn't in any way, those words against Islam, didn't in any way express his actual thought. Okay? And what's interesting about this is we just came across a very interesting quote from Pope Callixtus III. It's a very valuable quote. will appear in the future in our material against Islam to show you what the Catholic Church really thinks about it and how contrary to this, is the teaching of the post-Vatican II sect. This is Pope Callixtus III. This is after the Muslim sect, Constantinople. He says, quote, I, Pope Callixtus III, promise and vow to the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to the ever-Virgin Mother of God, to the holy apostles Peter and Paul, and to all the heavenly hosts, that I will do everything in my power, even if need be with the sacrifice of my life, aided by the counsel of my brethren, to reconquer Constantinople, which in punishment for the sin of man has been taken and ruined by Mahomet II, the son of the devil, and the enemy of our crucified Redeemer. Further, I vow to deliver the Christians languishing in slavery, to exalt the true faith, and to extirpate the diabolical sect of the reprobate and faithless Mahomet in the East. So, the Catholic Church holds that Islam is a diabolical sect, an evil sect of the devil. That's the teaching of the Catholic Church. Vatican II showers its esteem on it. All these
Constantly.
all these bishops, quote, like this Sambi, constantly talking about how we're not against basically Islam, we esteem it, and so on. That couldn't be more contrary to what the Church teaches about it.
Yeah, and so really a person has to make a choice. The Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years now, a little more than 2,000 years, so or about 2,000 years, and a person has to make a decision whether they're going to follow what the Church has always taught, or are they going to follow what's being taught by people who are claiming to be Catholics over the last 50 or 60 years. I mean, it's really that simple, because and that's what I told this priest today. It's something where you're hearing one pope calling Islam evil, that's an evil religion, and Benedict XVI is praising Islam, constantly esteeming it. I mean, you have to make up your decision what religion you're going to follow. If you want to be a Catholic, you have to follow the Catholic religion. If you don't want to be a Catholic, then you're going to follow this new modern false religion that claims to be Catholic.
Another interesting point is we've pointed out, and others have actually pointed out as well, that the present situation in many ways parallels especially liturgically, parallels the break from the Catholic Church in England following King Henry VIII's schism, and how they changed the Mass and they changed the rite of ordination after that, and so on and so forth. But there's a really interesting quote in the book, The Rise and Growth of the Anglican Schism, about what happened when they instituted this new Protestant service. And the Catholics, avoided this Protestant service because they didn't think it was truly sacrificial, they didn't think it was valid, and so on. But some of the priests who serviced them were still compromising and saying both. They were saying the new Mass, and they were saying the traditional Mass. And what's interesting is that many people today some people, and many we've contacted, are in a situation where they've received sacraments from priests who, say the true Mass, but also say the new Mass. And so they want to make sure they're not getting hosts from the Novus Ordo, of course, but only hosts consecrated in the traditional Mass. What's fascinating is this is from a book written in 1585. It could have been written yesterday. It parallels so closely to what we're saying. I just want to read a passage from it. It's incredible. And it says, she also compelled, referring to Queen Elizabeth, the people to frequent the churches as before, and according to the act inflicted a fine of 1 shilling upon everyone who should be absent on holy days, meaning those who were avoiding the new invalid service. And he goes on, and thus by force or fraud it came to pass that the largest portion of Catholics yielded by degrees to their enemies, so most of the people went along, and did not refuse from time to time publicly to enter the schismatical churches and hear their sermons, and receive communion in the new invalid way. At the same time they had Mass said secretly in their own house by those very priests who in church publicly celebrated the spurious liturgy. So he's pointing out that some of these people had Mass said,
the real Mass,
by priests who said the false Mass. And he goes on, and sometimes by others who had not defiled themselves with heresy. Yea, and very often in those disastrous times were on one and the same day partakers of the table of our Lord, and of the table of devils, that is, of the Blessed Eucharist and the Calvinistic Supper. So he's referring to the priests who say both. And he goes on, he says, yea, what is still more marvelous and more sad, sometimes the priest saying Mass at home, for the sake of those Catholics whom he knew to be desirous of them, carried about him hosts consecrated according to the rite of the Church, with which he communicated them at the very time in which he was giving to other Catholics, more careless about the faith, the bread prepared for them according to the heretical rite. So it's fascinating that he could write that. He's saying that these priests would administer the validly consecrated host to certain people, and the invalidly consecrated host, the same priest, to other people. And that could have been written about many inbuilt situations today. And it just shows you how clearly the liturgical revolution after Vatican II parallels the liturgical revolution of the Protestants. Another thing that we could talk about in this program is we want to talk maybe a little bit about Martin Luther and his revolt from the Catholic Church. Because when you really get into the specifics of the revolution of King Henry VIII or Martin Luther from the Catholic Church, and you read the blow-by-blow accounts of what they did, and you dig into it, and you see how ridiculous and absurd and outrageous it is for anyone to follow these religions. It's just astounding. And so actually, we may talk more about that in the next program.
Yeah, and so we'll be posting, in the future, when our next program will be on. Next time it will be appearing on our website. Thanks.